My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church here in the Salt Lake Valley, and we welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. Before we get started this evening, I'd like to let you know that we're going to have some interesting guests the next 2 weeks. We're going to have Sandra Tanner next Wednesday, and then we'll have Charles Larson, the author of By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus, 2 weeks from today. And so that'll be a real privilege to have them with us. But this evening I wanted to deal with something that has been a distraction to many people who either are Christians or have considered becoming Christians. Christians are demonized. There are all kinds of things that are said against Christians. There are some things that are true that Christians actually have to answer and deal with. There are a lot of things, though, that are made up. In the early church, 3 accusations that were made over and over against Christians were that they were atheist because they didn't have an idol that they bowed down to, that they were incestuous because they greeted each other as brother and sister and greeted one another with a holy kiss, and they were also accused of being cannibals because those who knew a little bit about them had heard this language of eating the flesh and drinking the blood of Jesus Christ. The church answered those things. Today we have other lies that are perpetrated against the church because the world can't deal with the truth. The Christian faith is true, and it stands up to scrutiny. No one has anything to fear from the truth unless they choose to believe a lie. Christianity stands that test. But the world keeps inventing lies like cannibalism and incest and all these other things to try to distract from the reality. One of the greatest distractions has been essentially in 2 parts. One is that you will hear many atheists and agnostics say today that religion is supposed to have killed more people than anything else in all of human history. And they assert this without any evidence whatsoever. Now, it's true that there are many wars that have involved people of different religions, and they have called upon their gods in those fights. But to somehow demonize Christianity when it fights back against Islam with shields bearing a cross rather than a crescent moon, that's not exactly religion killing people. Atheism as a movement, as a philosophy, has killed 100 million people in just the last century, basically. But one of the lies that has gone hand in hand with all this is somehow that Christianity is ignorant and hostile to reason and to truth, and that its only response must be hatred. And I think there's no greater example of that lie being perpetrated than the story of what went on in the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. Many of us have seen the movie Inherit the Wind with Spencer Tracy, and it is a fictionalized account, and yet it is presented as history. And it's not just fictionalized in terms of changing a few names here and there. The whole context of it is a lie. We're going to see a clip here that gives you some taste of Inherit the Wind, a 1955 play made into a movie in 1960, which has shaped the understanding of millions and millions of American school children in terms of the idea of Christianity and evolution and a whole host of other things. Let's get a taste of what's put forward as the truth within public schools and within the media.
Your Honor, the defense has brought to Hillsborough at great expense and great inconvenience 6 noted scientists. Their testimony is basic to the defense of my client. For I intend to show this court that what Bertram Cates spoke quiet one spring morning in the Hillsborough High School is no crime. Incontrovertible as geometry to any enlightened community of minds.
In this community, Colonel Drummond, and in this sovereign state, exactly the opposite is the case. The language of the law is clear, Your Honor. We do not need experts to question the validity of a law that is already on the books.
Well, what do you need? A gallows to hang him from?
That remark is an insult to this entire community.
And this community is an insult to the world. Your Honor, I request permission to withdraw from this case.
Mr. Drummond, you can't quit now.
Why not? You were ready to 5 minutes ago.
Colonel Drummond, what reasons can you possibly have?
Well, there are 200 of them. And if that's not enough, there's one more. I think my client has already been found guilty.
Is Mr. Drummond saying that this expression of an honest emotion will in any way influence the court's impartial administration of the law?
I say that you cannot administer a wicked law impartially. You can only destroy, you can only punish. And I warn you that a wicked law like cholera destroys everyone it touches, its upholders as well as its defiers.
Colonel Drummond.
Can't you understand that if you take a law like evolution and you make it a crime to teach it in the public schools, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools, and tomorrow you may make it a crime to read about it, and soon you may ban books and newspapers, and then you may turn Catholic against Protestant, and Protestant against Protestant, and try to foist your own religion upon the mind of man. If you can do one, you can do the other, because fanaticism and ignorance is forever busy and needs feeding. And soon, Your Honor, with banners flying and with drums beating, we'll be marching backward, through the glorious ages of that 16th century, when bigots burned the man who dared bring enlightenment and intelligence to the human mind.
I apologize. It looks as if the soundtrack to that got unsynced to the picture itself, but the gist of it's clear. Spencer Tracy portrays this wonderful defense attorney who is defending, I don't know if you recognize the man who played Darren on Bewitched years later. He is defending him against these charges made by these ignorant Southerners. Earlier in the movie, he's dragged out of his classroom by something resembling a lynch mob. And this is the picture that so many people have of biblical Christianity, that it is violent, it is scared of the truth, and it burns people at the stake. We sponsored a debate that was co-sponsored by the Humanists of Utah, and we had a Christian and we had an atheist, and we had our table set up at the back of the lecture hall, and they had theirs, and they had these little flyers saying, "We welcome our heretics, we don't burn them at the stake." The reality is that in the last 100 years, atheists have slaughtered, not necessarily burning at the stake, but with a bullet, a whole host of their heretics. They've killed them by the millions. But this is a lie. It's a fiction. And the whole trial is altogether different than the way it is typically portrayed. Rather than being a bunch of hicks ranting and raving against the idea of evolution, the trial that took place in 1925 in the city of Dayton, Tennessee, was a publicity stunt. The impetus for it was that the ACLU was unhappy that there had been people like William Jennings Bryan who had been arguing against evolution being taught in the public schools as fact. And Tennessee had passed a law called the Butler Act, which forbade the teaching of evolution. And what we really have is the question, some resources I'd point you towards if you like more information on this. There's the Pulitzer Prize winning book by Edward Larson, Summer of the Gods. It's not exactly a fringe book, Pulitzer Prize winner. And there's a couple of a couple of discs in a video series called The Unknown History of the 20th Century by Gary North. It's a good resource as well in terms of the history. North has said some not so bright things on other areas, but he does have some insights in others. But part of the issue of what was going on there was whether the citizens, whether the parents who actually were compelled to pay for the public schools could decide what was to be taught in those schools, or whether it was something that was going to be dictated from some elite somewhere else. And rather than it being this way that it's presented, it was something that was meant to provide the ACLU with a trial case to take to the Supreme Court, and also it was meant to be a show. And the express purpose of the show for some of the participants in it was to humiliate Christianity in America, and it succeeded, I think, beyond the wildest dreams of many of the people involved. Tennessee had passed the Butler Act, saying that evolution could not be taught in public schools. Now, why would that be an issue? The reason for that was that evolution was not simply a matter of science. It was a whole worldview, and it affected a whole host of issues, including the creation of the eugenics movement in this country. This is what horrified people like William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was a Presbyterian. He was not raised Presbyterian. He had joined the Cumberland Presbyterian, which is not exactly the most orthodox group of Presbyterians out there. Eventually moved over to the mainline Presbyterian Church USA. But he had been championing for a number of years, trying to drive evolution out of the public schools. Now, he is important because he was one of the most popular political figures of his day. He was 3 times the Democratic nominee for president. He lost 3 times, twice to McKinley in 1896, again in 1900, and then he came back in 1908, lost again by even a worse margin. This was essentially in a divided field where I think you had the Democrats, the Republicans, and I think he was coming in as an independent or third party. That's back during the time of Theodore Roosevelt and the Bull Moose. I can't remember if that was at that election or the following one. But at any rate, in 1912, he was made Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. Served in that capacity for several years until he saw what he believed was Wilson trying to force the Germans into a corner where he could bring America into World War I. And he resigned in protest. He had been an anti-imperialist earlier in his career. He had been lampooned as a coward because of that. He had, but he ended up being right, that Wilson was trying to get the U.S. into the war. As presidential candidate, he had been a very progressive candidate. He wanted inflation because he believed that this would cause commodity prices to rise and would enrich farmers. He saw some of the things that had taken place in terms of deflation with not coining silver as putting farmers more and more enslaved to banks, and was getting harder and harder for them to pay off their loans and things like this. So he wanted free silver. That silver could be coined into money, and that this would increase the money supply and create inflation. He was one of the innovators in terms of pushing for income and inheritance taxes. He was an anti-imperialist. Frank Baum, the original Wizard of Oz book that he wrote, The Yellow Brick Road, you have not ruby slippers, but silver slippers. It's talking about the arguments going on over the money supply at the time. William Jennings Bryan was actually the inspiration for the character of the Cowardly Lion. He was lampooned as a coward because why would we not take over the Philippines and Cuba and everywhere else? Why wouldn't we build our empire like everyone else was? He was a big fan of prohibition. He was a big fan of women's suffrage, the right to vote. He was also very tight with a lot of theological liberals. In terms of the social gospel, he was he sat on the Temperance Committee of the Federal Council of Churches and on the General Committee of the short-lived Interchurch World Movement. So he was very liberal socially in a lot of ways. He wanted a bigger government to take care of the poor. But the thing that he hated about evolution was that he saw that evolution undermined care for the poor and for the needy. The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin publishes in 1871. And he makes clear what had been implied earlier in The Origin of Species. He makes clear that if there's the survival of the fittest, we need to try to weed out the unfit among humans. Charles Darwin said in The Descent of Man, "With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus the weak members of civilized society propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care or care wrongly directed leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." William Jennings Bryan, despite being very progressive, very social, gospel-oriented in so many ways, he reads that and he's horrified. Because if man is to be treated like an animal, where the unfit are not allowed to reproduce, where they're killed, that's the antithesis of everything he has ever stood for. Having lost the presidential election 3 times, got the most electoral votes of any man never to win the White House. His first election, he was actually, the popular vote was fairly close with McKinley. And in some of the swing states electorally, it was very close. But he came up short. So he reads this and he's horrified because he sees where it goes. It leads to concentration camps. It leads to euthanasia. And having lost the election 3 times, having tried to become, he was Secretary of State, resigns from that. Then he runs for moderator of the Presbyterian Church USA in 1923, loses that by, once again, small margin. This becomes his cause. He's in his 60s, and his cause is to warn the world about Darwinism. He is not a biblical conservative. He does not hold to 6 literal day creation. He tended to hedge a lot in terms of a whole host of things in Scripture. But what he knew was he hated this idea that we weed out the unfit. This idea of Darwinism wasn't just being taught by Darwin, it was being taught in the schools. In fact, the science book that was being used in the Dayton school, a textbook that was used throughout Tennessee and had been used for a number of years there, was being used there in Dayton. It was a book by George W. Hunter called A Civic Biology. And here are a few quotes from that showing the influence of Darwin in terms of eugenics. He says, at the present time, there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. This is what William Jennings Bryan was opposed to. And he's portrayed as basically a knuckle-dragging ape in the press. He is portrayed as ignorant. He's portrayed as a Southerner, which he wasn't. The whole thing, as we'll get into, came more out of New York than anywhere else. But this is what was being taught as science. Now you can imagine that the atheists of today are embarrassed by this. This is what they were defending. They also don't like for you to understand that the eugenics being described in 1914 by George W. Hunter led to the forced sterilization and murder of tens of thousands of Americans in the name of eugenics, in the name of creating a more fit race of humanity and following Darwin's direction. They don't like that. They don't like that the eugenics laws created here were taken over to Germany and used to excuse the killing of millions. They don't like that. But that's the truth. Another quote from the book that was being used in Dayton. If the stock of domesticated animals can be improved, it is not unfair to ask if the health and vigor of the future generations of men and women on the earth might not be improved by applying to them the laws of selection. This improvement of the future race has a number of factors in which we as individuals may play a part. And then finally, one other quote just to give you an idea of what's in this book that was being opposed. He says, studies have been made on a number of different families in this country in which mental and moral defects were present in one or both of the original parents. The Jukes family is a notorious example. In 75 years, the progeny of the original generation has cost the state of New York over $1.25 million. If such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Now, this isn't just theory. It was being done in America at that time. Eugenics was the popular thing of the day. Over 60,000 women were forcibly sterilized in one mental institution that was, I believe, in the state of Indiana. Lincoln, Illinois. They purposefully introduced tuberculosis into the water supply of the patients so that they could achieve a 30 to 40% annual death rate. When Hitler started giving a good death, euthanasia, that's literally the etymological breakdown, good, Thanos, death, euthanasia, giving a good death to the mentally retarded, to the paraplegics, to the useless eaters, as he termed them in the 1930s, America cheered. The New York Times cheered. People like Margaret Sanger cheered. Margaret Sanger was very, very clear that her purpose was to stop black people from reproducing. So William Jennings Bryan and others were against Darwinism being taught because they saw where it led. So they had succeeded in getting states like Tennessee to pass a law forbidding these kinds of texts. Well, the ACLU didn't like that. They wanted a test case that they could take to the Supreme Court to try to get it ruled unconstitutional. They advertised for someone to bring them a case. They offered to pay all the expenses and everything else, but they wanted a test case so they could go to the Supreme Court. And the manager of the local coal mine, Cumberland Coal and Iron in Dayton, Tennessee, his name was George Rappelia. He was from New York, and he knew of this. He'd seen the advertisement. So he calls a local attorney and by the name of Sue Hicks, possibly, there's debate over this, but possibly the man who inspired the tune that Johnny Cash made popular, The Boy Named Sue. He got the story from Gene Shepard, who wrote A Christmas Story that was made into a movie back in the 80s. Small world. Anyway, George Rappelia, the manager of the coal mine, calls on Sue Hicks, local attorney, and George White, the superintendent of the local schools. They have a meeting in the drugstore there in Dayton. And he pitches the idea. Dayton's a town that's not doing so well economically. Now, Rappelia has his own agenda. He's an atheist. His father had been a skeptic, agnostic. And so he has his own agenda, but he knows that to sell it, he needs to pitch it as a publicity stunt. This will get people to come to Dayton, and maybe this will make something out of Dayton. They like the idea. But then they try to figure out, well, who are we going to get to charge with this? Now, the school science teacher was also the principal, and he didn't want to play this game. But they had a man who had received his law degree. He was the football coach. His name was John Thomas Scopes. Scopes was the football coach, and he had filled in for the principal in teaching biology one day. And frankly, he couldn't remember whether he had ever taught evolution or not. He actually sincerely doubted it. One of the things in the trial was they never wanted him on the stand because they didn't want him asked the question, did you teach evolution? Because he would have honestly had to say, no, I don't remember ever teaching evolution. And the whole case goes out the window. The man who puts this together, Rappelia, he's a showman. He's been frustrated apparently dealing with only a coal mine. Now he's going to do something big. And so they reach out to William Jennings Bryan, who has been this very notable national figure and has been against evolution. They ask him, will you come and help prosecute this? He also reaches out to everybody under the sun on the atheist side, will you come and be part of the defense? He even writes to H.G. Wells, the British author, who is a very outspoken atheist and evolutionist. He reaches out, will you come be part of this? William Jennings Bryan had an ego, and he saw this as an opportunity to try to drive home this point that he had been arguing for a number of years now. They appealed to his vanity. It worked. Well, when Bryan signs on, Clarence Darrow, who was a fairly well-known attorney. He had just gotten through defending Leopold and Loeb and had gotten them a long prison sentence rather than death for taking a young boy and sadistically murdering him. Clarence Darrow has been called the last of the village atheist. He was very well known. He signs on, he's going to play the defense. Now, before Darrow even gets involved in this, when William Jennings Bryan finds out about this, he volunteers up front. If the man is found guilty, if John Thomas Scopes is found guilty, he will pay the fine. Now, Inherit the Wind portrays a lynch mob breaking into the classroom, dragging the guy out. None of that took place. In fact, when you read the reports from the newsmen who were there, it did turn into a sideshow, because there were people who were looking sort of like at Temple Square at conference. There were people looking to stir things up. But never did you have this hatred and animosity and everything else. What you had was a group of people that they're in a dying town. You know, the town had kind of boomed after the war. When it first gets started, they had pushed the railroad through, but then it was dying. It wasn't going anywhere, and so they reach out. They treated the people well. John Thomas Scopes was never treated badly from any of the reports that I've seen. The jury only hears, in all the days of the trial, only is in the box about 20 minutes. So much of what goes on in the court is wrangling between the attorneys because they're trying to make a show of it. And in one of the famous situations, what's portrayed in Inherit the Wind, there's an agreement between William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow that they're going to cross-examine one another, which is ridiculous in a case like this. The attorneys are going to cross-examine each other. William Jennings Bryan agrees to go first, and it becomes clear he is not a literal interpreter of Scripture. But he tries to dance around it, and he's supposed to get his go at Clarence Darrow the next day. Well, judge rules it all immaterial, and that day never appears. William Jennings Bryan is portrayed by H.L. Mencken, famous writer for the Baltimore Evening Sun, as a fool, as a total idiot. He lampoons him every way he possibly can. Finally, the defense, the prosecution makes its case, and the defense says, you've got Clarence Darrow stands up and says, ladies and gentlemen, or gentlemen of the jury, you must convict. The jury manages to make it through the crowd, out into the hall. They all look at each other, they agree, they come back, they find him guilty. That's the case. There's none of this hatred and this righteous indignation and all this stuff. Yes, Clarence Darrow tried to make a fool of William Jennings Bryan. In fact, H.L. Mencken admitted that he was doing everything he could to make Bryan look the fool. And there was cooperation from liberal ministers, from a whole host of others trying to come against Bryan. Bryan did not handle himself well. There are all kinds of claims that are made. Some are true, some are not, in terms of Piltdown Man being a fraud, being referenced, and he was mentioned by the so-called experts. This was what was considered science in their day. It was a fraud. Piltdown Man was something invented to try to support Darwinism. Nebraska Man wasn't mentioned. There are claims that it was mentioned, but it was popular science of the day, but it was a fraud too. But what comes out of all this? Basically, Christianity's made a laughingstock because of the spin that took place then, and the spin has only gotten far worse. Inherit the Wind is a total lie. It is something that is put forward to try to discredit Christianity and to portray the good person as the atheist. Well, what happens in the aftermath of all this? I've told you some of it. 1927, Carrie Buck appeals all the way to the Supreme Court. She was raped as a 17-year-old, and under the new eugenics law, she was declared mentally unfit. So after her daughter was adopted, they told her that they were going to operate on her for her appendix, and what they really did was they sterilized her without her consent and without her knowledge. It was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes, once more one of these enlightened atheists, he says the principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The state has the right to take you against your will, strap you down, and castrate you. Or cut your fallopian tubes, or do whatever they want to because they know best. One of the ironies in all this, atheists love to say that they ridicule Christians as believing in a flying spaghetti monster. Darwinism is a scam in a whole host of ways, but one of the ways it's a scam is that it offers purposeless nature producing purposeful man. So you don't have a God to start with, but you have one at the end. And the idea that man is evolving gives scientific warrant to the old paganism. The old paganism had Pharaoh as a god, or Caesar as a god. All the old pagan religions basically had some kind of deified ruler. The state was God. Christianity comes along, Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, but unto God the things that are God's. Caesar's not God. Caesar is legitimate as the ruler, and you render to him what he is due, but you don't render to him what's due only to God. Caesar's not God. Christianity inherently limits the role of government. Atheism comes along, Darwinism comes along and endorses what the people in power want to hear, which is they're there because they belong there. And there is no one higher. And they are the voice of God. And so just because you pay for your kids' public schooling, just because they have to go or else you're going to be locked up and they're going to be locked up, they're going to be taken away from you and everything else, just because you pay for it and just because they're your kids, you don't get to say what they learn. The state knows better. Do you see how it all works together? And it's a lie. The Scopes Monkey trial was a farce. But it got portrayed. It was the first trial broadcast around America. WGN out of Chicago literally ran lines to Dayton, Tennessee, so that they could broadcast over WGN the trial proceedings. It was front page news around the country and around the world. And to an extent, Christianity's never recovered, because this is the lie. We're a bunch of ignoramuses, and we're evil. Unlike the good eugenicists like Margaret Sanger, who want to save us by killing us. We're going to open up the phone lines. The phone number, if you'd like to join in the conversation this evening, 801-973-TV20. That's 801-973-8820. Now, this has been a long presentation. I appreciate your patience. But I hope you'll join in the few minutes we have left. I apologize, last week we had some technical difficulties. I kept seeing the phone lines light up and go right back off again. We had a phone that had been misplaced on the carriage and that wasn't working. And so anyone who tried to call in got bumped right back out again. But Darwinism won, and it has shaped our world ever since. To a great extent, Christianity has retreated into pietism. And it helped fuel dispensationalism. Dispensationalism basically said, you don't try to change the schools, you don't try to change anything. The world's in the Laodicean church age, and we're just going to get worse and worse, and you don't polish the brass on a sinking ship. You just worry about saving souls. That's all there is in life. And they've always told everybody they're in the last generation, and so you don't have to worry about your children and your grandchildren. You don't have to worry about the church and institutions and things like that. You can cop out and feel pious about it. Eugenics researcher, the American Harry H. Laughlin, he is the one who created the model eugenic sterilization laws for this country. He was very proud of the fact that they were implemented in the 1933 racial hygiene laws in Germany. Remember, 1933. In 1936, Laughlin was invited to an award ceremony at Heidelberg University in Germany. It was supposed to be on the anniversary of Hitler's 1934 purge of Jews from the Heidelberg faculty, to receive an honorary doctorate for his work on the science of racial cleansing. This is straight out of a Wikipedia article if you want to check up on this. This one part about Laughlin. Due to financial limitations, Laughlin was unable to attend the ceremony and had to pick it up from the Rockefeller Institute. Afterwards, he proudly shared the award with his colleagues, remarking that he felt that it symbolized the common understanding of German and American scientists on the nature of eugenics. That's what Scopes brought us. That's what Scopes brought Germany to some extent. We're going to go to Roland in Provo. Roland, good to have you with us. Roland?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I tried to comment on statements that you made last week, but you brought in a new giant question here that most people cannot understand and have no comprehension of the scientific background that you developed, and you're knowledgeable about this, but it does not do anything for the general public that watches your show. Maybe you just was more interested in certain ones, but I was interested hearing you when you announced next week you're going to have certain important visitors, and among them, of course, Sister Mr. Tanner. Of course, she's in all the non-Mormon discussions. She's on Redshift. She's on the Anchor John Anchor show yesterday was on. She's used by everybody on every non-Mormon discussion, she puts in her knowledgeable opinions, and of course she
You need to get to your question, Roland.
you that is competent enough to comment on the. So I don't know if I was going to comment on your last week, on weeks before. We always talked about the statements of LDS presidents and officials about denouncing other religions, denouncing and becoming offensive to other religions, and I agree with that. I was going to mention that but the problem is that that from the very beginning, Joseph Smith's claims have been ridiculed, opposed, and sometimes violently, and denounced in words and print, starting with, I think, Abner Cole, Obadiah Dockler, called
Okay.
Alexander Campbell,
Roland, you need to get to your point. What's
and Fawn Brody, various.
Roland?
Yeah,
You need to
sorry, I can hear you.
give me in one sentence. What is your question or comment, please? Can you give me one sentence? You've gone on for 2 minutes.
I think I. Yeah, I'm sorry. You threw me off. You threw me off the thing with that long discussion about the.
Okay, Roland, last chance. Can you please, in one sentence, give me your comment or your question?
I think I better quit here because you threw
Okay.
off the whole discussion with that Darwinism thing, and that
Okay,
the.
all right, thank you for calling, Roland. Yeah, I'm not clear on what the point was, but this applies to Mormonism. Nobody has anything to fear from the truth. I hear complaints all the time that I'm having that woman on. Here's the issue. What is the truth? There are things that are matters of perception. There are things that are matters of opinion. But there are also things that are documented facts. What's presented in Inherit the Wind has no connection whatsoever with the reality in terms of any kind of substance. Was there a trial on evolution? Yes. Almost nothing else is the same. This is like portraying the American Revolution as a bunch of bloodthirsty cannibals who wanted to, or better yet, the Abraham Lincoln vampire hunter. The Civil War wasn't over taxation or slavery or anything like that per se. The Southerners were a bunch of vampires. Thankfully, not too many people actually take that seriously. Unfortunately, a lot of people take seriously other fabrications about it. But there are things that we can actually go back and look at and compare. Ebony Magazine was very upset to discover that Abraham Lincoln really wasn't such an opponent of slavery, except when it was politically expedient in 1863. But up to that point and prior to the war, he was actually very much in favor of slavery and said he'd embrace it in a heartbeat if it kept the Union together. They were very upset to find him saying very negative things about black people. There's real history out there. Mormonism has a real history. Joseph Smith was furious that the Nauvoo expositor was saying that he was practicing polygamy and doing all kinds of other things that were being officially denied at the time. And he said they were lies, and he said that they were a public nuisance, and he had them destroyed because he didn't want to deal with their claims. Turns out that what they were saying was true. And it gets it gets accepted by the LDS Church today. Were they practicing polygamy back then? Yes. But Joseph Smith said it was a lie. John Taylor, publicly, in Boulogne-sur-Mer, France, he was asked whether the LDS Church practiced polygamy. He quoted to them. I think it's Doctrine and Covenants 101. At the time, it's no longer in there. It got cut out, replaced with a new section 101. And now you've got the new section, 132? I didn't come prepared for this evening, the polygamy section. But 101 originally said that each woman should have only one husband and each man should have one wife. Now it's kind of coyly worded there, where it doesn't say only one wife. But Joseph Smith didn't even live up to that. He took women who were already married to other men. John Taylor, when he stands up there and denies polygamy, had numerous wives. They were lying. But there's truth. It's not that we're being mean, nasty, and that we only know how to attack. I hear that all the time. People, you don't put anything positive forward. You only know how to attack other people. I put all kinds of positive stuff out there. But everything I say has to respond to the errors around it. Almost every epistle that was ever written by any of the apostles who actually knew the audience to whom they were writing dealt with the errors as well as truth. What we should all do is bring things out into the light of day. Now we've got a couple minutes left. If you want to try to squeeze a call in, our phone number here, 801-973-8820. But so many Christians, they look back on Inherit the Wind, which they saw in their high school history class, and they think, I don't want to be part of that. That's embarrassing. I don't want to be some Neanderthal Southern zealot. Well, you might as well say that the Southerners were a bunch of vampires, which is what Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, the movie, was supposedly about. Then they've done there's been a lower budget one trying to draw on the appeal. I think it's Abraham Lincoln Zombie Killer or something like that. That's not history. Neither is Inherit the Wind. Neither is what the LDS Church teaches. Have people killed others in the name of Christ? Of course they have. Have there been judgments that Israel was told to go in and kill the Canaanites? Of course they were. But the idea that atheists are the voice of reason, I took issue with a young lady at the debate over the thing about, she said, it said that we don't we welcome our heretics, we don't burn them. I said, really? How about the 100 million killed by atheistic communism? How about the killing fields of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge? How about Mao's China? How about Soviet Union? How about all these others where I would have been declared mentally ill and locked up or killed or sent off to die in a gulag? Or in Mao's China, just put in front of a ditch and had a gun put to the back of my head and had my family charged for the bullet. What about that? During the question and answer section of the debate, the speakers weren't aware of the conversation I'd had with her. She got up and she said, I'm offended. I'm offended. This man in the back told me I was wrong. And it's wrong to tell people they're wrong. I didn't have to invent that one. That one's on tape. That's on YouTube. She was offended that someone told her she was wrong because it's wrong to tell people they're wrong. That's the voice of reason. It's like, excuse me, ma'am, but aren't you telling other people they're wrong? Mormons, we don't attack anyone. We just tell you that all your professors are corrupt and all your creeds are an abomination, and we're the one true restored church. Why would you ever say we're not Christian? Just because we say that you're not biblical and true. There's facts out there. We're going to be dealing with them in terms of Mormonism over the next couple of weeks. I invite you to tune in. But these are facts. Don't play the victim. If something I say is incorrect, call me on it. I made a challenge to a young lady a number of years ago. She came up and saw a copy of By His Own Hand upon Papyrus. I said, ma'am, if you find a substantive error in there, I mean something that really deals with the argument itself, not something peripheral. If you show me something wrong, I'll publicly apologize, I'll pull it, we'll never offer it again. She came back 2 years later and told me she was now a Christian, because nobody has anything to fear from the truth except those who want to believe a lie. We stand for the fact that the Bible is the truth. It's the only infallible, inerrant source we have. We invite you to worship with us Sunday mornings at 8630 West, 2700 South at 11 a.m. We have a sister congregation, Berean Presbyterian, meets at 9 a.m. at 3350 Harrison Boulevard up in Ogden. And I am starting a Bible study in the next couple of weeks in Provo, Sunday nights at 5:30. If you would like to join us in any of these, call us at 801-969-7948. You can see past episodes at YouTube at ancientpaths.tv, and you can check out our website at www.christpres.net. Till next week, we wish you the Lord's greatest blessings. Good night.